Thank you for the opportunity to give this talk. What I'm covering today is an analysis of the science, the policy and the management of wetlands in a changing climate. Within the talk, I have a question for yourselves, for the viewers. That is, are we succeeding or not with the science, the policy or the management of managing wetlands under climate change? I've left that in there for yourself. I anticipate the information that I provide will help you come to your own answer for that. Starting the talk, we haven't got a happy starting point. The Global Wetland Outlook done in 2018 for the Ramsar Convention showed that natural wetlands, inland and coastal, have declined over many, many years. At the same time, the area of artificial wetlands has increased, but this has not replaced the area, let alone the function, of lost wetlands. These losses of natural wetlands occur in all parts of the world, as shown by the top graph here for Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, North America and Oceania, and for both inland and coastal wetlands. Natural wetlands are in decline, including from individual and large-scale disasters that are incredibly important. They are not uncommon, but we don't know necessarily when they're going to occur. They can drastically change the face of our wetlands, as these three photographs show here. One in Brazil, a mine tailings spill wiping out a large area of the river downstream. In Australia, on the right-hand side, a fish kill in early 2019 killed an estimated 1 million fish in this river. And in the US, the Gulf of Mexico oil spill from 2010 is also known to have had large impacts on many, many wetlands and many, many wetland species. Given that we're losing wetlands themselves, it's not a surprise that the populations of many wetland-dependent species are also in decline, and many are even threatened with extinction. That is, they could be gone, they could be lost. This graph here uses the Living Planet Index, which is now a widely used index, looking at changes in species populations since 1970 when the data starts. The lower line on the graph shows freshwater ecosystems. They're in worse condition than many other ecosystems around the world. So with this background, I want to ask, where are we failing? Are we failing with the science? Are we failing with the policy, or are we failing with the management, or some combination of these? My proposition is that the policy is failing the science and especially failing the management. I'd be interested in your views on that later. And the bad news is it's not likely to simply get better in the future for wetlands. Wetlands are highly vulnerable to climate change, and at a policy level, we are not up with the climate game, nationally or internationally. So wetlands are known to be highly vulnerable to anthropogenic climate change, and this is likely to have significant adverse consequences for their ecological character. Climate change can affect wetlands directly through the effects of warming, for example, and indirectly through interaction with other pressures such as water extraction or changes due to the construction of dams across rivers, etc. Climate change is happening now, and it is officially recognised as happening now. The Australian government, for example, has formally recognised that change at one of its Ramsar sites is due to climate change. Adverse change in ecological character is due to climate change, with drying conditions impacting on the peat areas of this wetland. It's also highly possible that climate change is adversely affecting mangroves in northern Australia, causing their dieback, including in the Kakadu National Park Ramsar site. Photographs show these two sites. The Amua Bionup Ramsar site in Western Australia is a peat-based system which is drying. There's drying across this entire area, and that is leading to the development of acid sulfate soils and the carriage of fire further into the wetland as it dries. The mangrove dieback is shown on the right-hand side in Kakadu National Park. The photograph shows the canopy dieback of many of these species. The actual graph or the map that is shown there shows that there is while there's a loss, about 15 to 20%, depending on how you calculate it, of the mangroves in this area have died, there's also some gain, which is due to changes in the sedimentation pattern through the system as well. So it's a complex change, but we are very sure that climate variables are part of this, and climate variables are part of climate change. So climate change will have very different range of changes in different wetland types. It's highly possible we could get to extremes of changes in different types. It won't all be the same change. A changed climate will alter the hydrology, which is critical for wetlands, and the wetland function may be impaired by increased temperatures, drought or flooding, the opposite there, carbon dioxide increases, or salinisation. These changes will affect critical functions in ecosystem services such as carbon storage, biodiversity support, wildlife habitat and water quality, which we value highly. Negative impacts related to climate change will be compounded by synergies with other stresses such as invasive species and land use change, potentially making wetland management and restoration far more difficult and increase the risk of species extinctions. Some freshwater wetlands, however, may be resilient to climate change within certain bounds of temperature, precipitation, water level, salinity and storm activity, and probably other factors. Being able to predict this is quite difficult though. Climate change, the implications for policy. Climate change has considerable ramifications for existing policy and management for maintaining the ecological character of wetlands. Wetlands are under pressure, and this is likely to increase under climate change. But the drivers of these changes may not always be readily identifiable. Managers do require guidance on how to assess and respond to the consequences of climate change, given their obligations under the Ramsar Convention for one, to report any adverse change in Ramsar sites and to address the ongoing degradation of wetlands globally. Note that Australia has decided and informed the Convention that it will not report change in Ramsar sites if it is due to climate change. I am unsure if this has been discussed across the Convention, as climate change does provide a dilemma for Ramsar reporting obligations. The parties are required to report changes in adverse changes in ecological character of Ramsar sites. If climate change is affecting all these sites, we have a big reporting demand and it may be unrealistic. Examining water policy in the context of climate change, examining wetland policy in the context of climate change. We used experience from wetland researchers and managers in Australia and New Zealand to examine the implications of climate change for wetland policy and management, to identify potential adaptation measures and the information needed to support these, and to provide a set of principles to guide adaptation of wetland conservation and management policy to climate change. On the basis of this work, we formed 6 principles to inform wetland conservation and management policy within the context of climate change, just to make it clear of our bounds here. I will quickly run through these. The text in white font shows the key elements of these 6 principles, of each principle. 1, the objectives and targets for wetland management should look mainly, but not only, to accommodate and compensate for climate change, rather than trying to avoid impacts. We're saying this because it is likely too late to avoid them. These impacts, these changes are already occurring. How do we accommodate them? How do we compensate for them is where we think the emphasis should be in the future. The second, objectives for wetland management under climate change should include ecological, social and economic targets across multiple scales. We say this often, but we're not convinced it's done often. So how do we actually merge the principles, the operating scales, etc., of ecological considerations with social and economic considerations? But we think unless this is done, we will continue to face the problems we've faced in the past with the adverse outcomes that I showed earlier for wetlands. Number 3, flexible governance and adaptive co-management frameworks, again across scales and sectors, are essential for managing wetlands. It's not just about what conservationists want on their local wetland, it's about what others also want, and it's about what others also do in the wetlands and in the landscapes or the catchments that affect the wetlands. It's critical And it is critical that this is done in a flexible way because we won't know everything at the outset. We'll have to respond to the information from our actions. 4, easily reversed, no regret or low regret adaptation options with multiple cross-sectoral benefits should be implemented in the initial phases of adapting wetland management. There are actions that can be done now or are needed now that are unlikely to cause problems for managers in the future. This is really saying we need to take action now. There are some actions we can take, and they won't necessarily be the wrong actions for the future. That last point is very, very important. We need to plan, not just address issues in the short term. 5, long-term management strategies should identify triggers for new actions, including novel or high-risk adaptation options. This is a little bit different to the last one. We're now talking about the fact we need early warning triggers for when actions are needed. We also need to consider new and perhaps risky adaptation options. For example, species translocations from one area to another, and plan for these and know when to prepare and act. Therefore, we have to operate in an adaptive management framework, which is not or hasn't been widely adopted fully. We've talked about adaptive management for decades now. Where is it being really applied, and why not? 6, scientific monitoring and evaluation of management strategies are needed. These need to be hypothesis-based. We need to ask the question of the monitoring and then to set up the monitoring to prove or disprove the actual question. You can phrase that different ways if you talk about hypotheses. General sampling and checking every now and then if something is happening is unlikely to be sufficient. I think we've already shown that throughout our history of monitoring wetlands, and yet a lot of it still happens. We need to really set the hypotheses and ask the questions and test them properly. In doing this, conceptual models could be used to identify critical parameters and to allow future scenarios to be explored. These diagrammatic models that we can develop now can give us pictures of the futures, and they can be used to communicate messages to help get feedback on what is happening. So this is the policies that, the policy guidance that we've set, the actual principles or policies that we've recommended. Let's now look at the policy settings around climate change within the Ramsar Convention. The Ramsar Convention has prepared guidance on how to manage wetlands and to report on adverse change, but has not delivered guidance on how to respond within the context of climate change. It has shied away given negative attitudes by a number of countries. Keeping in mind that to get something through a convention like this, you need to get everyone on side to at least a certain extent. I see this as a missed opportunity to get ahead of the game and help managers prepare for complex changes that we are facing now and have faced for some time and will face in the future. I'll now provide an overview of these efforts from the years 2002 to 2015. And then give you a set of adaptation approaches that have been shown to have benefits for wetland managers and which would benefit from further consideration and the production or the delivery of guidance through the Ramsar Convention. So I'm referring to the negotiation processes within the Ramsar Convention from 2002 to 2015. There has been further effort in 2018, a slightly different emphasis to what I'm reporting here though. During this period, there were 4 formal resolutions negotiated through the convention. This involved formal decision making by the countries that are parties to the convention, also include observers and advisors, including technical experts. But it was the country delegates that make the decisions and accept the resolutions, not the technical experts or the observers. This started in 2002 with a resolution on climate change and wetlands, looking at impacts, adaptation and mitigation, the whole lot. This didn't prove to be successful. A number of countries stood up and said, we don't want this, it shouldn't be here in the convention, the background information is not right, etc., etc. That actually put things back. So it wasn't until 2008 that another resolution on climate change and wetlands came forward. It still faced a lot of opposition, a lot of arguments from different parties in this case, with some of them saying very, very strongly that Ramsar had nothing to do with climate change. All issues of climate change should be elsewhere. I'll come back to that. This led to another resolution, another go in 2012, and then another one in 2015. In 2015, the emphasis has shifted from looking at all wetlands to looking at peatlands, where there was a wider acceptance that peatlands were important for carbon storage, which helped to get some of the issues through. Not all the issues that were put forward got through the negotiation. My general impressions as a technical advisor to these negotiations, they reinforced the process whereby country delegates, not the advisors, made the decisions. In some cases, advisors were not included in the discussions even, asked to leave on some occasions. Generally though, observers and advisors could contribute, were invited, and were usually then asked to redraft the negotiating text for the parties overnight. So while you were not allowed to actually make the recommend the changes, you're asked to write them out on behalf of the parties. There's an interesting dynamic at times, but it worked in the end. Responses to the draft resolutions were at times dogmatic, to say the least, or even explosive, with delegates leaning across the table, screaming at each other. That was on a number of different occasions for very different reasons, but it was rather uncomfortable to sit there and watch this. These are adults trying to negotiate a very, very important concept. One of the big issues was seen by some parties, still is seen by some parties, I understand, Ramsar was not the place to discuss climate change and wetlands, as all issues related to climate change belonged in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, not in a wetland biodiversity convention, as it's often seen, despite wetlands being the topic. Early on, in the 2002 meeting in particular, climate change was claimed by some people not to be proven. Therefore, why are we discussing it? The Ramsar authors in the earlier episodes were also criticised as not having the expertise compared to the IPCC to actually table documents on climate change. The fact that the Ramsar authors were led by IPCC authors didn't seem to register with some parties. They were the same people in many cases. And others wanted advice on climate change and were bewildered or even angry about those who were blocking these discussions or blocking these resolutions. They wanted to know, they needed to know, and didn't have the resources to do it themselves. So it was a very tense situation at times. The outcome overall, there were decisions made, they were accepted, they were heavily compromised from what was tabled, and some issues were taken off the table. They came back as an understanding of these issues came back into discussion as the understanding of delegates developed over this period. In other words, delegates needed to be informed, they needed to be educated, and the information needed to be delivered in a way where they could understand from a policy perspective, not just a scientific perspective. And it became very clear the main objection to some parties was for the convention, the Ramsar Convention, looking at mitigation, not the adaptation issue. So mitigation was the sticking point, not adaptation, but it all got caught up together at times. NGOs became frustrated in this process, the observer NGOs, and some successfully took the case elsewhere. They took it away from the Wetland Convention to address wetland issues. I found that very interesting in itself. Increasingly clear messages and the acceptance that climate change was caused by humans helped move things forward. And in particular, it was seen that wetlands were vulnerable, in particularly peatlands. And this was a key to a later consideration about getting more action and more guidance through the Ramsar Convention. Peatlands were actually a area. Mitigation still, though, is the sticking point, and despite the increasing evidence that wetlands can accumulate and store large quantities of carbon gases if managed in particular ways, as they also emit large quantities. If they're mismanaged, you can increase the emissions and make the situations worse. Guidance on blue carbon carbon stored in coastal wetlands, in other words, is now being developed. This is a major step forward for the Convention to break through this mitigation issue. Where it goes from here, I'm still waiting to see, but we really hope it does go forward. So the Convention's processes for addressing and reporting changing epithelial character of Ramsar sites needs to take into account climate change. I don't see how we can manage wetlands into the future, given our record in the past in particular, if we don't address this major driver of change. So if we look at some of the adaptation options, what can we do about, how do we live with climate change in wetlands? There's a number of management tools which are already in use for managing wetlands, which can give us benefits for adapting to climate change. I'll just go through these very, very quickly. This includes delivering environmental flows to wetlands, noting that many wetlands, many rivers have been changed, putting water into wetlands at the right times of year, judging when the best time is, judging how much water can be put there, can help us respond to changes. It's obvious, I think, in that one. The restoring of riparian vegetation has many, many benefits for the fauna and the ecosystem services along the edge of many wetlands and rivers, etc. We know a lot about riparian restoration. In what we're saying here, more of this will help. It'll help lower temperatures around the edges of wetlands, for example, and it will change some of the dynamics and the nutrient transfers into habitat connectivity, improving habitat connectivity, restoring habitat connectivity, again, is an action that has been often recommended for helping to manage wetlands and rivers. It can also work in the case of climate, particularly in areas where it's starting to dry out. Geomorphic restoration, this really refers to fixing the banks, the substrate, the physical structure of the wetlands, which has been changed a lot in the past as we've tried to use wetlands. The conservation of gaining reaches, you may not be as familiar with this one, but this is looking at the interactions between surface water and groundwater in wetlands and making sure we do get the transfer either from the groundwater into the wetlands or in different places or in different seasons, from the surface water in the wetlands back into the groundwater to maintain the water balance. We can help encourage those processes and protect those reaches of rivers, etc., where it is already. Fish passage, this is a major one. This is just how do we allow fish and other animals, to be honest, to move upstream and downstream and from the rivers out to the floodplains, given we've put infrastructure into many of these systems which hasn't allowed effective movement of fish. There's all sorts of ways of doing it, and it's now very well recognised and has been for some years that not all fish behave in the same way. So therefore the design of fish ways needs to take into account the biology and the movement patterns of the local fish. Some research needs, we always say there's research needs, but here I just want to focus on a few things. There's a number of ecological processes on representative of wetlands, the connectivity, the refuge values, the trajectories of change already occurring in wetlands, all need further investigation. To me, this is just straight ecology. We also need to look at how invasive species establish or how we remove invasive species, noting that under climate change, many species could move. More species could move and could move further. Are they then invasive, or are they? What do we do? How do we manage them? Ecological research continues to determine the relationships between the ecological patterns and processes, the biodiversity and the processes which keep the wetland going. And importantly, we recognise the value of ecosystem services. Some of the information on these issues is not very clear in many places. And the last one here is to really jump outside the science, look at the social research to explore and enhance institutional issues, how we manage wetlands. We have management actions, how do we put them into place, in other words? And this is the funding, the implementation, the labour forces, and the actual monitoring, etc. Education is needed, and here I am particularly interested in the education of the policy and the decision makers who are making decisions now. We need action now. There's a lot of emphasis in education, etc. For school children. school children are important. We need that education level, but we also need people making the decisions now to understand. And when we do this, we shouldn't treat such people as idiots. We have to explain to them in a competent adult way, but in a way where they understand and can make the decisions that we would like. So just to finish this, keep in mind, we don't have a lot of guidance in Ramsar about how to operate or manage wetlands under climate change. It is the countries that set Ramsar policy and need to implement it. Ramsar is not a process that tells countries what to do. Ramsar, in effect, tells itself what to do. The countries tell themselves what to do. The failure to set policy on climate change resides with those who comprise the Convention. Therefore, this issue of emphasising the importance of climate change for wetlands with those senior people I just mentioned, that is critical if we want to get these processes through the Convention. And with that, can we then stem the well-documented deterioration of wetlands? We cannot, in my opinion, do this if we do not address climate change. Thank you very much. I'm willing to take questions either now or later. Thank you.